Good morning. My name is John Swamley. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I began my career across the street at 175 Remsen Street when the New York Legal Aid Society had its criminal defense office there for many years. And I cut my teeth on Skimmerhorn Street in the criminal court there and learned how to be a criminal defense lawyer from a St. Francis graduate who is a lawyer and who now still has an office on 26 Court Street, and who for 5 years basically taught me how to be a criminal defense lawyer. And then I ended up moving up to Boston and running into a group of people that were loosely forming around the idea that people that are wrongly convicted, that do not have the benefit of DNA and therefore the benefit of an organization called the Innocence Project, which I think many of you, even if you are not following law, may have heard of. The Innocence Project has gotten out, I want to say, over 220 maybe at this point. 289 individuals. And the way they've done it is by demonstrating that, that DNA that was collected over the years and not able to be used because we didn't have the right tests at the time. Now that we do have the right tests, that DNA still exists and rather readily can demonstrate whether someone is innocent or guilty of a crime in a way that couldn't have been done before. And what has been demonstrated is that there's a roughly 10% wrongful conviction rate across the board in the serious crimes in which DNA has been collected. Now that should hold true for cases, crimes in which there is no DNA. However, there doesn't appear to be much of an effort directed at trying to figure out how to systematically uncover the wrongful convictions in that area. And what is wonderful is that an organization called the National Center for Reason and Justice formed around the idea of trying to generate ways that people can fund and work on innocence cases where there is no DNA. Bernard Baran's case was the first case the NCRJ took. It was their inaugural case, and it's one where they put a lot of resources behind it and behind me in helping get B out of prison. And he was someone that they had been in touch with. They talked me into doing the case, and I went down and met Mr. Baran in, I want to say, 1999 was when I became involved in this case. And he had had several other attempts at defense, if I'm not mistaken, that kind of went nowhere. Some lawyers just weren't really interested in picking up the ball and running with it. And with a non-DNA case, it's sometimes difficult to even gather the resources. B can tell you, and he will give you his own particular way of keeping people involved. And it involved him writing letters himself, responding to people that might donate $10, $15, $20, and he kept track and wrote thank you letters to every single person that donated money to him and kept them abreast of what was going on legally. And every time we would go to court, and this took from literally 1999 until 2006 when we were able to get him out of prison. And we got him out of prison not as an exoneree. We got him out of prison with the tentative possibility of there being a new trial. That is, we won the right to have a new trial because of the injustices that went on in his first trial. And the question was going to be whether we were going to have a new trial. And if we had a new trial, how would we actually pull that together and try that case? Well, ultimately what happened is the prosecution appealed our winning this new trial, and they appealed it to the next level, and they got slammed with the most beautiful, beautiful appellate decision I think I've ever read. It made me weep. I was involved in the case, so maybe that's why I wept, but it made me weep to read it. It was such a thorough thorough job of exonerating B, and did so well that the DA's office decided we're not going to go any further with this case. We're not going to appeal it one more level, and we're not going to retry it. And they dismissed the case at that point. And so that ended it from the criminal perspective of them being able to do anything harmful to B again. And so I'm now going to roll back to the beginning and let B pick up where essentially when I met him, he was pretty much a broken man in the sense that he didn't want anybody, much less some lawyer come in saying I can help you. He didn't want to even hear me, and it was because his defense mechanisms were so thoroughly up and around him, he could not stand the devastation of having another person say I'm going to help you and then not. And he exacted one promise from us when we agreed to take his case, and that was, if you're going to take this, you're going to take this to the end. You're not just going to take it for a little bit. Otherwise, I don't want you. And that's essentially the first conversation I remember having with him.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I got arrested in 1985, which was at the beginning of, there's a lot of other stories about child daycare abuse cases, but there was no convictions at that time. So, and most of those cases took 2 to 3 years to do. Mine took less than 2 weeks. Through trial, through the whole procedure was approximately 35 days, probably, totally. Met John. I got Debbie Nathan actually talked to a friend of mine, Bob Chattel, and who was trying to help me at the time. And basically, Debbie went to him and said, if you don't help him, he's going to die there, because nobody cared. So Bob Chattel at the time thought, what do I do? I'm one person. How can I change what happened? I'm only one person. And then, of course, he talked to someone else who talked to someone else, and then the NCRJ became about. It's very, it's difficult in the sense, like Emily said, there's no DNA, there's no hardcore evidence. So in my case, there was a lot of prosecutorial misconduct by the district attorney. My attorney at the time was an alcoholic. He came to court with the same suit on 3-4 days in a row, asked me to ask the questions. I remember there was a doctor one time speaking, and I was kind of not really knowing what's going on, and he looked at me and said, do you have any questions, and handed me an empty pad. So I think not knowing the system the way I know it now after 22 years later, of course I thought I was in good hands, but I think at one point I knew when I got my own self out. I think the biggest issue back then was the hysteria around these kind of cases. When you're talking about doing something to children, it's a disgusting thing. It's things that people immediately want to pay attention to. So I think that the hysteria before anything factual was more the hysteria itself was the basis for the whole case. Me being a gay male, openly gay male, did not help with that hysteria.
You want to say how old you were?
Yeah, when I was 19. I'm 46 now. I spent 22 years in prison.
When he was 19 and going into prison, I was maybe 2 years older going into college. And what he was enduring was a small town mentality. He didn't grow up in Boston. Pittsfield is definitely a provincial town, a town which does not deal well with race issues, homosexuality, doesn't deal well with many issues.
Even today.
Even today, indeed.
Even today.
And
I say that only because one time these Phoenix reporters came and did this big article, and I told them how that community was, and I think they were kind of like, yeah, sure, it's kind of like that. And then when they came back, I was in the prison at the time they were doing this big article, And they came back to the prison, they all started whispering, so I said, what's going on? And they were like, that place is still like that. You know, Berkshire County is still as bad as you said it is, you know, even today, and that was 22 years later.
The reason he came to be arrested in the first place was because he was openly gay and he was working in a daycare center. And one of the families, the parents, and they weren't actually an intact family either. It was the mother was shacking up with the brother of her husband, and at that point in time, they came into the daycare center and said, "We don't want no homo teaching our kid." And when we got our discovery and we're doing the legal research on this, we learned that the board of directors of that daycare had meetings not about how do we address the prejudice within our community. They had a meeting about the Bernie problem, the homosexuality problem that we have in our midst. And thankfully, in the month that month or two that they were trying to figure out what they're to be, what ended up happening is that family came back in after the daycare center didn't do anything and made their first allegations. Well, he's touched our son. And we know that because our son said something in the bathroom. And all of a sudden, that began the
Firestorm.
And the investigation began. And then what happened in the daycare center panic kinds of cases is there was this kind of junk science, one that posited that children never lie, which, as a small child, you may not actually lie. You may be trying to get out of a tight situation. You might be doing any number of things. But as a parent, and I am one, I can honestly tell you, children actually do lie all the freaking time. And they do so not because they're necessarily trying to get someone else in trouble, although when they get a little older, they might actually figure that out too. The reality is that none of these children that made allegations against B were lying. In fact, they had nothing to do with the truth or the lie. They had only to be the vessels for these junk science psychologists to come in and say, well, didn't this happen? Didn't that happen? And they had puppet shows, and all of this science has now been thoroughly discredited, but it wasn't back then. And they would have anatomically correct dolls, and then they would give them to the kids and have the kids play with them. And one of the things that the research has shown is that children between the ages of 3 and 5, which were the age group that B was teaching and were the ones that were claiming he had offended against them, are not able to see a doll as a representation of themselves. They see a doll as a plaything, as a toy. And so they start playing with the toys. What we ended up with in B's case was not the 6 people that went to trial against him, but there were at least 15 other people that were screened in. They did all of this, and they didn't prosecute because they weren't strong enough. And we had videotape that was never used at B's trial. The best one was one where the kid on the video said, "You promised me a prize. When am I going to get my prize? I'm not basically, I'm not talking anymore until you give me my prize." And you kind of go, there was no offer of a prize on this video. I didn't hear that at the beginning of this. So you know a lot went on before they started rolling the tapes. And what ended up happening in B's case was they took the 5 best videos, and then they took the
Snippets.
incriminating bits from those 5 best videos and made a best of tape that they then showed the grand jury, which is how he got indicted.
And when they showed it to the grand jury, they did never say that these are edited videotapes. They showed them to them like they were just in their entirety, but they were hours and hours and days of videotapes that were cut down to 3 to 5 minutes.
They eliminated all of the exculpatory parts in these videos. These videos had kids going, yes, Joey did it. Oh no, it was Betsy. And I was with Bobby the whole time, and Bobby doesn't say anything happened. They're all over the map, but none of that went and was seen by anybody. It was just buried by the DA's office, and it was buried for literally 22 years. And when we originally began trying to figure out how to get him out, it wasn't because we had these wonderful videotapes. We didn't even know what was on the videotapes. What began when, unfortunately, this is a painstaking process when you don't have DNA. When you have DNA, you run the test is black and white. You're either the person that did it or you're the person that didn't do it. And when you're talking about a case like B's, there is no DNA and there is no coherent storyline that clearly expresses how you get convicted, but for reading the transcript. And I read the transcript, and some other lawyers read the transcript, and even without any videotape, we could go, oh my God, this fella did not get a fair trial. Now, how do you go about, once you read a transcript, figuring out how to get someone a new trial based on that? And literally, it took us from 1999 until, I want to say, 2004 before we got the videotapes. And what we did in between, he sat there, and his cousin got a little impatient with me and was essentially riding herd on me for a while. And the person doing, this was a collaborative effort. We had a team of writers working on this. And the main writer was getting bogged down in the minutia. But the reality was the minutia helped us get to the point where we got a judge to order them to find the videotape. And that's what we had to do to break this case open. And but we went through the transcript one page at a time and started highlighting these are examples of prosecutorial misconduct. Okay, then that was one issue. Ineffective assistance of counsel. His own lawyer really was a drunk and really did a bad job. And
John,
frankly, that made it easier.
Can you give a few examples of the prosecutorial misconduct?
Okay, prosecutorial misconduct took the form of, the blatant stuff that you could read directly from the transcript were things like the homosexuality was thrown in the face of the jury, and the notion that a homosexual is more likely to offend against a child was still a view that was widely held back then. And so what one of the statements in the summation of the prosecutor was, he is like a chocoholic in a candy factory. Just because he's gay and he has all of these little morsels to pick from. And that's essentially what the prosecutor said in that regard. But the prosecutor went beyond that. There were exculpatory witnesses. He had a boyfriend at the time who had a fair amount of exculpatory evidence to give. He was subpoenaed every day to court and held down in the basement of the courthouse with a guard watching him. And essentially, they kept him away from the defense lawyer, who wasn't trying to do a real stellar job by himself anyway, but essentially they kept witnesses away from the defense team to keep them from being able to testify. Now, so I mean that's some of the prosecutorial misconduct. Brady is a case that was decided a long time ago in the United States Supreme Court, which requires the government to turn over exculpatory evidence. They did not do that in this case. What they were able to get away with saying is they made these tapes available to his defense lawyer, and his defense lawyer never chose to go look at them. Now, my perspective on that is not enough in terms of the law and what the law requires. The law requires, even if you have an idiot defense attorney, here, you have those. You may never look at them, but you have them. Instead of, you want to see him, you got to come to my office and see him. That was what was essentially the laid out for the defense lawyer in this case, and he never looked at them. Never, ever. And in fact, nobody really looked at them except the grand jury, and then they put these little kids on and had them testify. And one kid had difficulty testifying, and the prosecutor said, well, when you get done, we'll get you a hamburger at McDonald's. And the kid was able to finally finish her testimony.
And the oath that they took also was changed.
They were not required to tell the truth, the whole truth, not but the truth, so help you God. They were required to tell what happened.
What happened?
Just say what happened.
And the judge actually, when he was competency, there's one that one of the kids that he gave competency because she knew her colors. That's how we got from there to her competency was by colors because she knew what colors were which.
There are numerous instances of misconduct both by the prosecutor and the judge. The courtroom was closed to the public when the kids testified, and that was 3 years after a Supreme Judicial Court decision here in Massachusetts that says you cannot, it's not here, up there in Massachusetts, it says you cannot do that. And when that decision came down, they still closed the courtroom without making any findings or anything in that regard. So we had lots of little itty-bitty examples of why he got an unfair trial, but what was the thing that broke the case wide open was convincing a judge that even if these tapes, the prosecution said they couldn't find the tapes, they lost them. And it wasn't until the DA that was originally on this case, way, way back, died while shoveling his walk of snow. He died, and 4 months later, his replacement, lo and behold, found the videotape. That prosecutor had no investment in the case. Didn't care one way or the other whether we got the video. And that's probably why we got the video. And the video cracked this case wide open because you could then, and we did, give it to an expert named Maggie Bruck from Johns Hopkins, who is an expert in the suggestibility of child witnesses. In fact, she's written the book on it. And, and she showed the judge her own studies with kids in them where she had, she played doctor, basically. She gave kids a tongue depressor, and, well, actually, she gave kids an exam with a tongue depressor, nothing else, basically, and had the kid come sit down on the examination table, took the tongue depressor and rubbed it along the bottom of their foot, and then sent them home. 4 days later, brought them back, gave them an anatomically correct doll and a tongue depressor, and said, do what I did to you 4 days ago. And these kids were sticking tongue depressors in any hole they could find, were doing whatever they wanted with the tongue depressor and the anatomically correct doll. And very convincingly, in a very short set of experiments on video, this doctor can convince you that it's very easy to suggest to a child almost anything, and certainly get a child to put a tongue depressor in a hole that, that was not used by that doctor 4 days earlier. And she did that, and then what she did was she took the naughty bits that were excised from the large videos, and she demonstrated in the context of each of these videos how they were not representative of what the kids were saying, and how they in fact skewed what the kids were saying to make it seem like they thought B did something, when in fact they thought nothing of the kind. With that, we were able to convince a judge that he deserved a new trial. And it still didn't get you out of jail right away, did it?
No. No, it didn't.
When we got him out, you were on GPS. And
for 3 years.
There's a special place in hell for people that think that GPS makes our society safer and is not an intrusive, awful thing to do to somebody. It is horrible punishment, and you can explain why.
Yeah, the system that they have in place for this GPS doesn't work. There were times when I would be in one area in 1 minute, and then they'd have me 20 blocks away within 3 seconds. I was back and forth constantly. The phone system that they put it on doesn't work. One time they show me in Mass, Boston, Mass, then I'm all the way in Worcester within 10 minutes. It's a system that doesn't work.
What does it make you feel like is the
surreal.
Well, it doesn't feel like you left prison, and it's more. I think when you're in prison for a certain amount of time, you develop the way everything goes. You kind of just go with it. But with this, it was pretty bad because you always had the fear of, if I'm not home by 10 o'clock within 5 minutes, it's a 5-minute time limit, and they automatically put out a warrant for your arrest. If I'm not home by 10, I could be back to prison. You never know. I mean, during the time that I was on that bracelet, there were so many problems with the bracelet. And of course, my fear all the time, as soon as something goes wrong, you can go back to prison. It's a violation. No matter what's going on in the courts, it's still considered a violation. And we had not finished with the courts yet. There was no final decision at that time. So I think there were times that the GPS probably was worse than the stress and the heartache of prison, because you had everything kind of like in your grasp, but not really, and knows that it could be taken away at any moment. So there was no surety of anything that I did until just recently.
Can I just ask you to talk a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions about your experiences in prison as a sex offender. You were at Bridgewater, the treatment facility, a little bit about that. I remember getting a letter from you when you were in prison, and I didn't understand why you were at a treatment facility. So maybe you can
You want to
talk.
hit the Massachusetts thing, and then I'll talk about the other stuff.
Okay. There's a facility in Massachusetts prison system called the Treatment Center. It's an affectionate term for it. It's really the Nemanskett Correctional Center. But ostensibly, they treat sex offenders there, and they house sex offenders there. And the theory being that if you get enough treatment, you will be safe enough to be released back into society. Although that's really not the goal. The goal is to keep you there. And if you are an innocent person and you are sent to a place like that, it's a pretty freaky place to be, where everyone that you're with is a sex offender. That is, except for the other innocent guy. And the other innocent guy and B found each other in that prison and knew, he can explain how they knew, but they knew that they were both innocent. And they bonded and they managed. And this is a guy who was big, brusque guy who was homophobic. And it's like, yes, this is my one true innocent friend. And they became friends, and they're friends to this day. In fact, when B got out, after he lived with me for a little while, he ended up moving in with moving into Dennis's house when Dennis moved out to another house. So people have taken care of each other in this field. But back to the prisons.
The treatment center also, I'm sorry, is you have a prison sentence, which I had a second-degree life, but when you go to the treatment center, you get committed there civilly. So you actually have a civil sentence along with your criminal sentence. The way I ended up getting to be evaluated was, one, because of the nature of the crimes, but two, they had it so because I was having such a hard time in the regular prison system that this place would have been much safer.
And it was.
And it was. It was a different atmosphere, totally different from prison. In prison, touch a little bit about what Emily said. There's always a pecking order, just like in regular life. And child molester, lowest on the totem pole. If you're a homosexual child molester, there's just no other lowest to go. So, as you can imagine, I'm not a big dude. Times were tough in there. There was a lot of awful things that happened in prison. And it's just, so in
Not
a
to
way,
sugarcoat this, B was raped repeatedly. And B had cigarettes put on his head to be killed if other inmates could do it. And the guards permitted it. And the guards knew what was going on. In fact, in a couple of instances, the guards left the scene so that they could beat the crap out of B. The remarkable thing about B, and if you haven't noticed this yet, the remarkable thing about this man is his resilience and his unbelievable good nature. I have not encountered anyone who has been through what he's been through and is not the bitter, broken man that he could or should be. And that's, frankly, that's what I find most remarkable about him, is his ability to rise above it interact with you all, I mean, he got out of prison not knowing what a cell phone was. And he's quite adept at a cell phone now. And he's managed to come out and know that I need to enjoy the life that I have left, and he does. And in the time that he lived with my family, he made a profound impact on my own children. He allowed my children to understand that our government screws up, that mistakes are made, that no one automatically jumps in to fix them. If you're going to fix them, it's going to be you fixing it. It's going to be somebody else going, oh my God, I got to do this, not because it helps me necessarily, but it does. It helps us all. And my kids both wrote their college essays about the profound impact he had on their lives. And when he came and lived with us, just out of prison, I mean, my middle kid was going through her high school stuff and kind of a misfit and not realizing, what her moral compass was and how to get there and what to do. And he came in and he could do what parents couldn't do, and can relate and the kids could relate to him. And when he gives talks, people can relate to him just because they get what he's been through and realize. Here he is. It's just
one final thing about the treatment center. Don't you have to talk about how you offended, and so?
Well, that's the other thing about the treatment center. They have all these. Barbara Schwartz, who wrote the book on SDP, which is sexually dangerous persons. First of all, you can be there for any reason. If to go to the treatment center could be you have a personality disorder, like if you don't want to talk to other people. That could be a reason. In prison, if you don't want to talk to other inmates, that could be a reason to send you to the treatment center because you have an antisociable personality. They make you sit in the groups. They have 2 groups every week, and then classes, all different kind of classes of sexually offending. My issue was I wouldn't do those kind of classes. I would not do those things. So basically they just housed me there telling me under civil commitment, because now I have no prison time. They kind of go concurrent in Massachusetts. So I really don't have prison time. So now I had a second-degree life, 2 second-degree lives, 5, 8 to 10. Now I have a civil commitment, which is now called a data life. So you go to a safer prison, but you give up your civil rights. You're giving up courts. You're giving up, so you have a data life. So the prison, it's weird because it's structured where it's safer, because you have all the people there, same crimes. So it does have a level of structured safeness. There also was a lot more therapy there for people to talk about, just their issues around sexually offending. And in a way, I'm kind of, if you have to look back, I maybe was fortunate to get to that treatment center, because I don't think that I would have made prison at that point, because everything just got too much. No hope, no thought of ever getting out, but yet still trying to keep that little fire burning. So I think, things happen for a reason. So I think that the treatment center for me was a nightmare and probably a lifesaver at the same time.
Okay, so does anyone have any questions or comments?
On behalf of the heterosexual community of the world, I apologize.
Thank you.
Did that family ever give you any feedback?
Tell them a little about the accuser's family.
the initial accuser's family.
Yeah.
You want to do it?
You can do it. You're quicker at it.
The brother of the husband of the kid that was the putative father. I mean, I don't know how to.
The uncle.
The uncle that was living in the home with the
Pretending
mother
to be the father.
Right. He came forward partially on several different occasions. One of which he came and wrote a letter saying, "I'd like to come clean on this," and he handed it to a relative of his, and then never did come clean. He was conflicted. I went and found him, and he wouldn't talk to me. He said he might talk later. He never did. That guy died just
A few days ago.
a month or so, within the last month. So no one has actually ever come forward and said, I'm sorry, nothing like that.
He was deposed one time and did say some things in his deposition which kind of led where he felt wrong. He didn't believe what would happen. He believed that Julie Heath, who was the mother at the time, convinced him to say things. He also tried to talk to my mother once. He felt, I don't know, guilty or whatever he felt. Second thoughts, tried to talk to my mother. That whole case, the initial accusation came, the mother and the boyfriend were arrested, or at least for drugs, and they were informants. So they worked for the police department. They were informants, and they back then. And
these allegations came out.
So these allegations came out after they were caught in a very bad situation themselves, which had to do with drugs. And so now, instead of that situation blew up, so now all of a sudden it became about me. So that's an issue that's.
And they were drug addicted.
They were drug addicted. The mother, actually, both of the father and the brother had both stabbed themselves in the heart while they were staying
Reality
with her.
is she probably stabbed him in the heart. But
Yeah, supposedly. So, and then the same child in the first accusation had already been taken out of that home like 3 or 4 times through DSS because of injuries or bruising. But yet, when they came to the police, it was immediately.
And the child was put in the daycare center because the home was not stable, so that's why the kid was in the daycare.
Was in the daycare in the
anyway,
first
so-
place.
And if you want to complicate things even more, once the kid was taken away from that family, and was during the entire time period this case was going to trial, that kid disclosed that someone else abused him, and they buried that.
To the
And
foster parent.
that abuse ostensibly occurred chronologically prior in time to the whatever B was supposed to have done.
At the same facility?
No, in the home, in mom's home. It was mom's boyfriend, previous boyfriend, after the father and before the uncle. Anyway.
And that's other evidence
But-
that we never got either during that time.
And if you're trying to follow the pathology of how this unfolded, that first case may not have gotten taken off were it not for the fact that when one of the people on the board of directors called another person on the board of directors who had a kid in the daycare to tell them we've got an issue here, she immediately went to her kid and started grilling her kid. She was herself abused as a child, and she wanted to make sure, and she was not believed, and she wanted to make sure that her child was believed. She was best friends with the wife of the chief of police, and that's what set just like a rocket, this took off at that point. So, I mean, then they started manufacturing cases. Yes.
I have a question about the trial itself. I imagine you helped select a jury. When you were trying to select the jury, what kind of people were you looking for in a case like this?
I have the good fortune of being able to say I had nothing to do with that trial. I did not. I didn't screw that up.
Was there a second trial?
There was never a second trial.
There was never a second trial.
They concluded that they could not put their case back together. They didn't have a case, frankly, and they dismissed the case at that point.
I got one other follow-up. How has life been after prison for you? Have you had trouble getting jobs? Has there been a bias against you?
I was fortunate in the way that I had a lot of supporters. So when I first got out of prison, though, it was hard to get a job because I didn't want to lie. And I tried to stay with my craft, which was, baking. And, I would tell people. I was in prison for 22 years, and just give them the stuff, fortunate enough to website and newspapers. But there were a lot of people that wouldn't hire me because of the fear that I'm going to isolate some people. And in a business, you don't want to isolate anybody. So there was always that fear. I remember there was a couple opened up a bakery in the area that I had moved to. I applied like 3-4 times. I really thought they were going to give me the job. And then they just said that they couldn't take the chance of losing any customers because it was a brand new business. So it was very difficult at first. I was fortunate enough that one of my supporters brought up another woman, Deborah Bernard, who owns a landscaping company. And she basically said, if you ever need a job, call me. So after like 3 months of not being able to find a job, I called her and she hired me right on the spot. And I've been working with her ever since. I've been there almost 5 years now. And so housing, that was the only thing that I was not so forthcoming and truthful about. Because I couldn't imagine walking up and saying to somebody, I would like to rent this apartment. I know it's expensive, but I don't have a job, and I've been in prison for 22 years. I was wrongfully convicted, but just let me get this apartment. I really need it. So that was probably the only time that I said something like I was a broker and I used other people's money, and that's what I told her. But she came out to find out that, you know, the truth by newspapers. And actually, she was really kind and, you know, good about it. But I will say that Dennis Mayer, who's a friend of mine, he's DNA 187, I believe. He also had a hard time finding a job because even though Dennis was cleared with DNA in Massachusetts, he still has a criminal record. So when he went to go get a job, he worked for Waste Management. But when he went to get a job, he got Corey'd, which is Corey says he raped 3 women. And that still is not cleared up to this day, and Dennis has been out for 8 or 9 years now. And I think I'm going to have, do I have Corey issues also?
You do, but if we have a lawsuit pending with the state right now, and they promise if we resolve it, they will wipe it off his record.
And that's under the Compensation Act in Massachusetts.
So that record can be expunged eventually, but you have to change the law?
The law is on the books now that allows for people that were wrongly convicted to go back and correct their record. Dennis is one of those people that should have his record corrected. It hasn't happened yet, so both of them should be able to do it. It's just the reality is that once, and I don't know whether it's the same here in New York, but in Massachusetts, no one that developed the computer system to put all these names in thought about how to get them out. And there really isn't even though they can say, pass a law, we're going to expunge, there's not a physical way to do it.
Okay, but then if you know that, wouldn't it then be at least forgivable for a person who, like me, who is innocent, to just not say anything about it?
Well, he can definitely go and apply, and so can Dennis, can apply for a job and say, I do not have a criminal record,
Right.
even though when you query me, will say I do.
There's a student.
Did the state ever apologize to you for conviction?
No, actually, all the way up until the end, they were saying, oh, we're going to retry him, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then David Capeless had a meeting.
He's the district attorney.
He's the district attorney. He had a meeting in his office, closed it off to certain people, and basically said that there was trauma back then to these people, and he don't want to bring it up, the same trauma all over again, so it was just best to leave the case alone. That's about what I got for an apology, which
That's not an apology.
That's not an
We
apology.
still think you're guilty, but we can't prove it.
Yeah, and you know, well, maybe the Compensation Act will be their apology.
What's the compensation act?
There's a $500,000 maximum compensation act in Massachusetts, which was enacted where people that were wrongfully convicted, the state basically was saying, what's our role in that? You know, what do we do to compensate these men? Because there's a lot of states that have no money. There's some states that have $20,000 compensation acts. So, you know, this was the state's way to say, okay, how do we make it right, our involvement in these kind of cases? And that's where that bill
You still
came
have
in.
to sue them, though. They won't give it to you.
Yeah, they don't give it to you. And it's always like a negotiating thing, like an insurance, if you were to do something with insurance. It's not just forthwith, which I think you should have a check when you walk out that door, at least right there at the courtroom for that part.
Are there any programs helping you, say, getting employment or anything of that nature by the state?
No, the strange thing about that is, I'm glad you brought that up. If I was guilty and got out of prison as a convicted man, there's all kinds of Massachusetts programs for you. There's programs to help you get back in school. There's a loan program. There's programs for education. There's all kinds of programs. But because I was innocent and now proven to be innocent, I was not allowed any of those programs. So there was all the programs that they put in place to help get men back into society, I was not allowed any of those because now my case has been overturned. So it's kind of there is a lot of programs in Massachusetts for men, but if you are once you're proven innocent, there's nothing. There's no programs whatsoever.
nothing wrong with helping the guy out that is guilty, but what about you?
Yeah, it's tough, and it's tough to swallow that too. You know, like you go out, there's nothing there for you. You know, you have to do it on your own, which, you know, maybe makes you that much stronger, I guess. It's just another battle, you know.
Any more tests? Any other questions or comments? Any students have any thoughts? Yeah.
So what are your future plans? Will you try to go back to maybe open your own bakery?
I actually have thought about that. I think I'm going to go back to school. I'd like to go back to school and probably work on my trade more. You know, to me, there's a lot I can do. You know, I'm 46, but I'm really 6. You know, I started my life all over again. So you know, everything's fresh for me, and the world's changed so much. So I don't feel like there's nothing I can't do. You know, so I'm just gonna try to take some opportunities and figure it out.
Okay, and I just want to say one more thing. When I was telling my students about your case, it's not just the homophobia and the hysteria about children. It's not just a historical moment. In fact, I'm not trying to embarrass any of my students, but when I told them about Bernard Baran, I said, would any of you have a problem if your children were in a daycare center and the teacher was a gay man? And a couple of students said, yeah, I would have a problem with that. Even though I said statistically, gay men are less likely to molest children than other adults, and victims tend to be young girls, heterosexual men tend to molest young girls. But at the same time, we still have so much homophobia, even college students who are taught to be critical. We've spent the whole semester studying this panic, and they still feel like that's a problem. And we talked a lot about fear about child molestation and child sexual abuse, and there's still a lot of hysteria and misinformation about the issue. So I hope that at least those of you who've been here all semester will think a little more critically about these issues. But I'm so happy that we had the seniors here this whole semester. I hope you'll come back for May 1st, and I hope you learned a lot, and it was so great to have you. And you, thank you so much for coming, Mr. Swanley.